Bom dia. É verdade que eu falo português, mas eu vou falar inglês, por favor. Desculpa. É que aí eu posso pensar melhor nas ideias e não tanto nas palavras. E aí eu não tenho que dizer a palavra desenvolvimento, que sempre me atrapalha. So first I want to start out by thanking the Fundação for the invitation and for sponsoring this wonderful conference and this great research. So it's true, I'm a cultural anthropologist. I did lots of research before in Brazil on the cognitive and cultural factors in how kids learn about race and cor here in Brazil, in Belmonte, in the south of Bahia, as Andrea said. And so it was a total coincidence and amazing luck that Frameworks got to start working on this project here in Brazil very soon after I joined Frameworks. So I feel incredibly lucky for that, and incredibly lucky to have found Julia and Paula to work on our team here. We couldn't have asked for better Brazilian anthropologists, so we're really excited about that. You have heard already from Susan and from Julia and Paula and from Andrea a little bit about the project that Frameworks is doing here, translating the science of early child development. Yesterday we heard a lot about the relation between public policies and the science of early child development, and today we're focusing more on the relation between the science and the public, how to get the public to understand the science so they can support the best public policies. And so, of course, to do this, we have to figure out how the public thinks about these issues. And in that spirit, I'm really happy to have the opportunity to comment on this Ibope research, which starts to take a look at where people are in their thinking about what is important for early child development. But what I want to do here, Ana Lucia already gave you a good synthesis of that research. What I want to do here is think like a social scientist, about how the different research methods that are being used in these two different projects can get us closer to that goal, the goal of figuring out how the public thinks about early child development. And so I want to use this Ibope research as a springboard for thinking more about our Frameworks project and for thinking about what we can do with this research when we get it. So although I'll be commenting and showing you results from the Ibope research, I'll be really using those results to think about the future and what we can take from that in our Frameworks project as we move forward. And so I'll be pointing out lots of the same things that Ana Lucia did, and that's good. I'm glad we agree. But I'll be looking at it through a different lens, the lens of Frameworks methodology. So I'll be showing slides from the Ibope report. Thankfully, those are still in Portuguese. Let me see here. So the first point that I wanted to draw your attention to is that when we look at the answers to this question, what's important for the development of 0 to 3-year-olds, at the top of this list, you've got vaccines and bringing the kids to the pediatrician. You've got breastfeeding. You've got being careful with food, what they eat. And as Ana Lucia said, it's all about health. So in some ways, that's good. Health is really important. And from what I understand about the recent history here is that there's been a big communications push to educate people about the importance of health issues. And so on one hand, it's great to see that that communication has worked. But then if you look at, down here, you only have 19% of folks saying that it's important to talk with the child. So on one hand, it's extremely good to see that the communications in the area of health have really taken root, but it's a bit disheartening to see such a low percentage of voice support for things that would help to build the architecture of the brain, like Susan talked about earlier. And of course, that's probably not news to most of you. You understand that public understanding about the importance of brain development is not really where it should be yet here for young children. And that's why you bring neuroscientists to these conferences and why the Fundação has begun to work with Frameworks to improve communicating about that issue. But But as a social scientist, I always want to treat survey numbers like this cautiously and not take them too literally. So what does it mean that 19% of people think that talking with children is one of the important things for their development? Does that mean that we've identified some actual percentage of people who firmly believe this, and we have to find those other people and change their minds? Does it mean that 81% of people really don't think that talking to their children is very important? Does it mean that people aren't talking to their children? With this isolated statistic, it can't really tell us much about that. It gives us an idea of what people are reporting about their beliefs in the context of this particular question. And so in the context of this particular question, they answered a lot more about health than social interactions. But when you look at this question, when the question is phrased as, what are the actions that stimulate development for 0 to 3-year-olds, you get this top answer here, 66%, was talking to children and reading to them and singing to them. And then only down here, I think at 11%, was something about health. Keeping children protected from other kids to avoid contagious diseases. So sometimes you can get what seem like contradictory results if you take the statistics too literally. That is, that they identify these fixed and firmly held beliefs to the exclusion of other beliefs. In fact, if you look at this question about love and caring, you had 24% of people thinking that it was important to talk with the baby during pregnancy. So that's pretty high, and that seems like good news. But then if you look over here, you see only 19% think it's important to talk with the child from 0 to 3 years. So more people saying it's important to talk with the baby in the womb than with the 2-year-old running around your house and trying to learn language. Now, does it really mean that people think that you should, talk more to an unborn child than one running around your house? Probably not. Does it mean that more people talk to their bellies than to their children running around? Probably not. So when it comes to our cognitive anthropological perspective, we look at these statistics as indicative of general trends, and we think of the answers not as absolute and firmly held, but we want to consider first the context of the specific question. We think that's really important. And second, we want to look deeper at the missing link here between the question, which we'll consider the trigger or the cue, and the response. In other words, the mind that people have, the cognition. And this is what Susan was talking about, that we think people have beliefs and assumptions about the way the world works, and we call those cultural models. And so we try to dig deeper into people's minds using social science research to find the cultural models that are operating. So you can understand, when you communicate about child development in this way, you trigger this cultural model, which will lead to this kind of thinking. So we think about this more fluidly as a communication cue coming in, activating a cultural model or a patterned way of thinking, and then a resulting thought or response. So going back to the idea of what is important for development. In our interviews, we talked about these interviews, you might start with the idea, what do people even think development is? I mean, you kind of know what it is because you're from here. It's a common word, even if it is really hard to pronounce for a foreigner. But we don't take it for granted what people actually understand when they hear that word. What if the word development just cues up all sorts of beliefs about health? Then it wouldn't necessarily tell us anything that people were answering about health to the exclusion of other things. So that'd be important to know. So to take an example from the case that Susan talked about, found that when people in the U.S. thought about the concept of stress, right, experts were thinking about stress as one thing, trying to communicate about it, but the general public thought about stress as something very different. Stress is good for people. So what we had to do from a framework's perspective was carve up that domain more, and that's where you get the metaphor of normal stress, tolerable stress, and toxic stress that you hear Jack and Chuck and others use so fluently. So in that case, instead of just saying stress, the experts say toxic stress. And then the public can understand something much more akin to what the scientist is trying to communicate. So we see this, the human brain not working as a dictionary, putting together meanings of words in some abstract context, but rather thinking about theories of how the world works, why it works that way. That's what cognition is to us, and that's how we approach communication. So how would we actually delve down and think about what Brazilians think about development? So like Susan explained, these are really intense interviews that we do, one-on-one, about 2 hours, although in Brazil, do jeito do que vocês são bons de falar, sometimes they took 4 hours. So we probe for all sorts of these issues. So to give you an example, one question, okay, I'm going to read you one question. It's one question with various follow-ups and various probes. I'm going to read it in English, but of course we asked it in Portuguese. So the question is, what is infancia? You know, Julia and Paula talked about how people's understanding of the word Primeira Infância. So after we asked about that, we asked just, what is infancia? And then all the things that follow were, you know, what ages do you think about when you hear that term? Are there different stages of infancia? What are those stages? Then for each of those stages, we would ask, what's going on with the child at that stage? Does the child have emotions at that stage? Thoughts, feelings, memory? Do children make decisions at that stage? Do they have responsibility? Can they think? Can they plan? What skills do they have? Do they have desires, wishes, intentions? Do they have will or self-control? What's the biggest difference between adults and children of that stage? So we don't take anything for granted, but we get people talking about all these foundational concepts that are going to be in play when they think through and when they hear your communication. Then when we get into the analysis phase, we can code these interviews using the software that Andrea talked about, and we can figure out the implicit patterns of thinking that underlie all that talk. And if we want to get people to think differently, then we can try to develop communications tools that trigger different patterns of thinking that lead to more productive results. So once we set the stage with this descriptive research, which we're doing in the coming months, we can put together all the other methods that Susan talked about to develop the communications recommendations. Just really quickly, a couple of things that I wanted to talk about. So Ana Lucia showed you this slide, which is, you know, when do people think learning starts? And of course, as you know by now, what we would want to do is follow up on this. So what do people think of when they think of a criança? What do they think of when they think of learning? What is that? Why do people think that way? But then she also talked about the different segments. So if you look at how this information is segmented by region and whether people have children and sex and other things, you find something that we might want to follow up on, which is that, so if you see in blue here, that means it's a statistically significant difference. So you see that people in the north and central west region are thinking differently about these issues. Say that people need to talk to the child more during pregnancy. That's really interesting and seems like a cultural difference that we might want to follow up on. So maybe there's some clue there that can give us an idea for something really productive in the way people are thinking in that region that we might want to build a communications recommendation off of. So this gives us good clues for doing that. But at Frameworks, we don't want to do this intense segmentation when we develop communications research. We don't want to have to figure out what's the best way to communicate with a white woman from the South in Class D, you know, compared to a black man from the Northeast in Class B. Instead, what we want to do is find the underlying cultural commonalities so that a communication can address a wide spectrum of people. And the good news, as Ana Lucia pointed out, is that there are actually very few differences. I mean, you can see here, the only differences that are statistically significant are the ones in blue or red. So out of this whole panel, only one statistically significant difference. And that's really good news for us, because Brazil can seem like a place that is so diverse in terms of region and class and race. And, but actually it looks like we're going to be able to find some really productive common ways of understanding to build our research. So just to conclude, I hope I've given you an understanding of how specifically this kind of research, the survey research, can be really helpful in what we do and the ways that we approach our goals at Frameworks, and how this research can help inform the current project, where we're going to try to develop communications recommendations to help all of you in your really important task of communicating about early child development and improving the social dialogue about those issues. So thank you.
Agradecer o Michael pelos comentários. De fato, há inúmeras possibilidades de se explorar essa subjetividade que compõe aí essa relação da mãe, da sociedade, em geral, com o desenvolvimento infantil, né? Um método quantitativo nos traz muito um panorama do que acontece, né? E o qualitativo nos possibilita nos aprofundar no como, né? E é muito importante que essas duas metodologias caminhem juntos para que, de fato, consigamos aí um entendimento ampliado aí das questões que a gente vem estudando.